Hi everyone, this is part 3 of my series on exposure for beginners, and today we'll be going over the settings in your camera that control exposure, like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now at this point in the series, I'm going to assume you have a pretty good understanding of the kind of numbers we'll be looking at for ISO, like 200, 800, 1600, and also shutter speed and fractions of like 1/130th of a second, 1/100th of a second, and also aperture, which are generally decimals like f2.8, f5.6, and so on. Also, that you have a good understanding of the relationship between these three numbers and what a stop of light is, because all of these numbers are indexed in terms of stops. Now, you can watch this video without really having a perfect understanding of those things, but if you'd like a more detailed explanation, you can watch part 1 and 2 of this series. But either way, let's go ahead and get started. I'll be working with the Olympus EM5 Mark II as my baseline camera. However, the settings should be very similar across all Olympus cameras and other camera manufacturers as well. Now, I'll be primarily referring to these controls on the camera: the front dial, the rear dial, and also the mode dial. And on the mode dial, you can see that we're in P mode or program mode, but also be going into aperture priority, shutter priority, and also manual mode. Now, looking at the back of the camera on the live view screen, the first thing we need to look for is what photo mode we're in, because that's going to dictate what control we have over the exposure settings. And in this case, in the lower left, you'll see the letter P, and that means we are in program mode. And that means the camera is going to automatically select the shutter speed and the aperture for us to attain the baseline exposure. However, we also need the ISO. And if we look above that, we can see that we're at ISO 1600. And if you look a little closer, you'll see the little letter A here, which means we're in auto ISO. So that tells me that the camera is also automatically selecting the ISO setting for exposure to attain the baseline. Now, in default settings, this camera has a baseline between 200 and 1600. So right now, we're at the maximum ISO range based on the default settings. However, I'm going to take a moment to switch this to go from ISO 200 to 25,600, or the maximum ISO this camera is capable of. So to do that, I just go into the menu by clicking the menu button. I go into custom settings, and then I go into menu E or exposure. And I'm just going to change the ISO auto set right here, and you can see the high limit is at 1600. I'm just going to bump that all the way to 25,600, which is the maximum. I can also set the minimum ISO, but I'm going to leave this at the lowest default setting of ISO 200. So, and just click OK and click OK, and we're good. And as you can see, the ISO is now 3200, and the camera raised the ISO because it wanted to select a faster shutter speed and potentially better aperture number to obtain a better exposure. Now let's take a little closer look at our exposure numbers. First, we have our shutter speed, and then right here we have our aperture, and then again here is our ISO. Now, on the shutter speed is always represented in terms of seconds. However, right now, this is not a 60-second exposure. This is actually 1/60th of a second. And when we go beyond a full second, you will see a little double quote next to the number. That would mean we are now in, for example, this would be a 60-second exposure. But since we don't see the double quotes, we are at 1/60th of a second. As you saw, the aperture was set to f4.0, and that number has a variable range depending on the lens that you're using. Now today I'm using the 14 to 42 kit lens, which has a range from say f3.5 all the way to f22. However, when you look at the front of the lens, you'll see an aperture range of f3.5 to f5.6. But what that number actually represents is not the full range of apertures available to you, but the maximum aperture throughout the zoom range. So let me demonstrate what I mean. Right now we're at aperture 4.0, but I wanted you to keep your eye right up here as well, because I'm going to zoom the lens in. And as I zoom in, the camera's telling me the focal length of the lens. Like right now we're at 42 millimeters, but look what happened to the aperture. It went to f5.6. And then as I zoom all the way back out to the 14 millimeter, you can see that the aperture dropped down to f3.5. Now some zoom lenses do have a fixed maximum aperture. So for example, the Olympus 12-45 Pro has a fixed maximum aperture of f4 throughout the zoom range. So whether you're at 12 millimeters or at 45 millimeters, you can stay at f4. Now prime lenses can have a fixed aperture of say f1.8 because it uses a fixed focal length. So I'm going to put a prime lens on now so you can see that the aperture number will go lower than f3.5. And now you can see after swapping to the 45 millimeter f1.8 prime lens, the maximum aperture can go as low as f1.8. So the maximum aperture is always going to be dependent upon your lens, and it can be variable, particularly if you're using zoom lenses. Now there's two more important indicators on the back of the live view screen, and that's your exposure compensation index, as well as the exposure value meter. So let's take a look at those. This right here is our exposure compensation, and I'll just call it exposure comp. And then right next to it is our exposure value meter, or EV meter for short. The exposure comp indicator and the EV meter basically serves one purpose, and that's to show you how far away you are from the baseline exposure. And you can either dial that in manually via the exposure compensation dial, or when you're in manual mode, the camera will tell you how far away it is from the baseline exposure based on the settings you put in manual. Let's look at the exposure comp indicator and the EV meter. And as you can see, the exposure comp right now is at 0.0, and the EV meter is also at 0 with a little green dot underneath the white marker indicating we're at 0. And basically this means we are at the baseline exposure. So what is the baseline exposure? Well, basically that is what the camera thinks is the proper exposure settings for this scene. And the exposure settings we are showing obviously now are ISO 3200, 1/60th of a second at aperture 4.0. So that is our baseline exposure with those settings. Now exposure comp, like I said, allows us to brighten the image or darken the image in terms of stops. So if I want to increase this exposure brightness by 1 stop or make it twice as bright, all I have to do is rotate the front dial on the camera to 1. So now we've increased our exposure by 1 stop, which is now twice as bright from the baseline exposure. And you can see the EV meter has also increased over to the first white dot on the scale. Now you may have noticed that the ISO indicator started blinking when we got to 6400 ISO. And that's the camera warning you that you're in a higher ISO. So any ISO 6400 or higher, when you're in auto ISO mode, that indicator is going to blink, just to give you a visual indicator that you're in a higher ISO. Now not all camera models do that. Most of them don't, but this one does. Now if I want to just darken the exposure by 1 stop, I can just turn the front dial the other direction, and now I'm -1 stop from the baseline exposure. Now the exposure comp indicator and the meter can also act as sort of a light meter in your camera, showing you how many stops over or underexposed you are from the baseline exposure. And you can do this when you're in manual mode. So let me just give you a quick demonstration. Let me make a quick note before we go into manual mode is that whenever you're in an automatic mode like program mode, aperture mode, or shutter mode, the exposure comp is adjustable. And like I said, when you go into manual mode, the exposure comp and EV meter become sort of a light meter or indicator of how over and underexposed you are from the baseline exposure. So let's just go into manual mode. And now you can see that the exposure comp and EV meter are indicating that we are -1 1/3 stops underexposed from the camera's baseline exposure. Now to get back to the baseline exposure, I have 3 choices: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. But each one of these have some limitations, right? The ISO, my range is really from 200 to 25,600. Shutter speed, I have a range on this camera of like 60 seconds up to 1/8,000th of a second. And aperture, using this kit lens, I have a range between 3.5 and f/22, depending on the focal length that I have. At the focal length I'm at now, because this is a variable aperture lens, f4.0 is the maximum aperture, the most light that I can let in. But when I'm in -1 1/3 stop exposure comp, I have to be able to let more light into the camera or brighten it. So I can either increase the ISO to brighten the image artificially, or I can decrease the shutter speed or slow the shutter speed down to let more light into the camera. And the aperture, unfortunately, I'm at the maximum aperture now, so I can't let any more light in by aperture. Now for this scene, because it's static, it's most likely this would be a typical landscape type scene. My first choice would probably be to slow down the shutter speed rather than raise the ISO, because I want to try to keep the maximum image quality at the base ISO of 200. So all I have to do is rotate, let's see, the rear dial. I'm just going to slow the shutter speed down to 1/5 of a second. And you can see now my exposure comp indicator and my EV meter are now both back to 0, telling me that I am what the camera thinks is the correct exposure for this scene. And basically, I just wanted to show you how the EV meter or exposure comp indicator now acts more like a light meter for your camera. In part 1 of this series, I introduced you to the kinds of numbers you'll be working with when we're talking about exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which would be decimals, fractions, and whole numbers respectively. And then in part 2, I explained the relationship between these three settings and how they're all indexed onto the same scale in terms of stops and what a stop of light is. And in part 3, I showed you where these settings are on the back of your live view or in your EVF. And I also introduced you to the concept of exposure compensation and what the EV meter is doing. Now in part 4, I'm going to go into the individual photo modes on your camera for program mode, aperture mode, shutter mode, and full manual mode, and how you actually control the exposure so you can take better images. So if you have any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comments below. But either way, hopefully we'll see you again soon.